Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in to this really exciting Thursday night edition of Establish the Show. For a showdown breakdown here at Establish the Run, I am Gary Hartman, joined as always by the one, the only, the great Cody Main for what should be maybe the best Thursday night game of the season. I know we had an early season one that was good, but we got a Ravens-Bengals game on tap tonight. Cody, how are you feeling about it?
I'm feeling good. Edwin correctly called it out. You can cash your,
Yep.
I think it was going off at minus 500. Tech Lord issues delaying the start of Establish the Show for Thursday Night Football. We're here. I'm excited for this game. This profiles as a fun one. Obviously, very important game for both the Bengals and the Ravens. Like the Bengals' odds to make the playoffs drop by like 20%, 30% if they lose this game. So a very, very big game for Joe Burrow and the Bengals. Tight spread, decent total. I mean, in terms of 2023, this is a pretty strong total. So I'm hoping for a close back and forth game and some offensive fireworks, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'll tell you this: you can't get more drastic of a difference from Week 10's Thursday night game of Panthers Bears to Week 11's of Bengals at Ravens. You mentioned huge game for both teams, but particularly Cincinnati. Baltimore's in pretty good shape. I think at 7-3 or whatever they are.
Mhm.
Huge game though for the Bengals after that disappointing loss to Houston last week. Crazy that we're in this position with the Bengals and the Bills right now, where both of them are less than 50% to make the playoffs, or right around 50%. Every game is huge. Not to mention, just this is a huge Bengals Ravens matchup. These teams don't like each other. It's been a rivalry now for a handful of years. I mean, obviously for a long time, but these Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow type of face-offs for a while now, and I'm really excited for it. Really, really pumped. Apologies for the tech learning. Yeah, you can see I'm on the road. Sometimes you guys might see this background every so often. This is my my in-laws' house. We go to quite often on Thursdays and Fridays. So on the road. Sometimes when I'm using my AirPods because I couldn't get my mic to connect properly on this setup here, and then it takes me a while and I go in and out and blah blah blah. You guys don't care about that. That's not what you're here for. You're here for us to break down the showdown slate. So Cody, when you were looking at this, I read your article before the show. Some great nuggets in there. Would encourage all of you to go check it out on establishtheRun.com. But what stood out to you from a construction standpoint or anything else about this slate?
Yeah, we're still going to have the Cincy value on the Cincy side, just because we don't have T. Higgins. We actually are losing Andre Yushovis, who is another wide receiver
Oh,
that they
really?
could throw out there. So
Didn't realize
Yoshi
that.
being out, like not a big deal, but low key, slightly impactful to some of the secondary and tertiary pass catchers on the slate. So we do still have the Cincy value that we had from last week on the main slate against the Texans. It's a obviously much tougher spot, but because price tag matters, because this is a single game slate and we don't have unlimited amounts of options, you're going to still find yourself funneling into some of these lineups that have Tyler Boyd and Trent Irwin and Tanner Hudson and things of that nature. So because of that, you are seeing it be fairly balanced in terms of roster construction. But I actually wouldn't be surprised if things trended a little bit more Cincy heavy than even projected in the table on your screen there, just because of the way the salaries work out and the way that Cincy's fantasy points tend to be distributed. Obviously, they're a much more pass happy offense. They're a little bit of a faster offense. They like to distribute their targets to their wide receivers, who again are fairly cheap on the slate. Whereas the Baltimore production can come through one or two guys, as we have seen on recent slates. So it sets up an interesting dynamic where, yes, the Ravens are at home as 3.5-point favorites, but you could potentially see more Cincinnati heavy lineups that isn't necessarily indicated here in the table on your screen. So that's one thing I'm keeping an eye out for. I think in some sharper fields, you could see a little bit higher utilization of 4 Bengals, 2 Ravens. So that'll be something to monitor as we get a little bit closer to lock. And then the other thing, kind of from a macro perspective, you would think that Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, all of these studs on the slate, that salary would be extremely tight. Looks like it's going to be a little bit looser. So I think you can kind of get onto some teams that you feel pretty comfortable about. We'll talk about some of those salary saving options here in a second. But I think from kind of an overall salary perspective, this slate feels a little bit looser priced than maybe you would think on an initial glance.
All right, good stuff. Let's dive right into quarterbacks and two guys that we're obviously very interested in here. Hard to paint too many warts on a Lamar Jackson case here, Cody. Obviously, I think for cash games, he should be a top priority. They are at home here. They are favored here. He obviously still adds something with his legs. And this Bengals defense, while still having some talent, is not the same as this Ravens defense is, which maybe we can paint some concerns on the Burrow side. Any warts or any issues with the Lamar argument?
Yeah, man, it's tough to find any negatives about Lamar Jackson. This is a Bengals defense that has been getting gashed through the air and on the ground. Obviously, both benefits to Lamar Jackson, who can do it with his legs or do it through the air. Though we haven't seen that over the last couple of weeks. I think maybe we get like a slight discount in some more casual contests on Lamar Jackson's ownership because of the recent game logs and people not paying attention to the fact that he's kind of just been scripted out of some of those games. There's been the running backs have been running hot on touchdown efficiency. The defense has been getting there in the box score as well. So I think that you might get a slight ownership discount, but I would be fooling myself if I thought we are going to get a low owned Lamar Jackson because of a couple of poor recent fantasy performances. He is a cash game lock, in my opinion. At 10.8, he's probably, $1,000 mispriced. He should probably be closer to 11.8, 12K, in my opinion, on this slate. So I think very much so a cash game lock. The interesting thing comes down to what do we do at the captain position? Because we have some interesting options at the running back position, obviously some interesting options at wide receiver and tight end. And I do think that we're going to see close to, if not slate high captain ownership on Lamar, whether it be 20 or 25% will kind of be where I'm finally settling in on his captain ownership projection. I think we probably get a little bit closer to that 20% range as you see now. I'm struggling with what to do there because he obviously still has slate winning upside and he can do it both on the ground and through the air. I think that based off of some of the other options that I'm interested in that are cheaper on the slate and coming through with less captain ownership, I would probably come in a little bit under that 20.2% in tournaments, but I have no issue if you want to just slam in Lamar Jackson. I think it's an awesome spot for him. I think it's an awesome spot for this Baltimore Ravens offense and also for them to kind of get there through the air. They haven't exactly been pushed in the way that we would want them to be pushed to see Lamar have to drop back more frequently. I think that will likely be the case tonight in kind of a more back and forth affair. And with this Todd Monken offense, when they're being pushed, when they feel like they need to score points on offense, you're starting to see a little bit higher of a pass rate than we've grown accustomed to in the past. So I do like Lamar, and I do think there's definitely a slate winning score firmly within his range of outcomes.
Yeah. Quote unquote due for Lamar from a fantasy perspective, right? 3 straight weeks between 12 and 15 DraftKings points, has not scored a rushing touchdown since week 7, but he's still rushing between 8 and 10 times, or I guess he had one outlier game in there in week 8, but basically between 8 and 10. So, early in the season, he was getting up to 13, 14, 15 times a game, which is why I don't mind him at the captain spot. Those ceiling games from Lamar, when he hits them, which is like, you're getting a couple touchdowns through the air, plus at least one on the ground, plus another 60 to 100 yards on the ground. When he hits those, he's usually reaching a ceiling that no one else on the slate can, and no one else on his team can. Even if he can carry out long some pass catchers with him, when he's hitting that ceiling, he comes on the ground as well. So those pass catchers, on the other side of when maybe we'll talk about Jamar Chase, et cetera, it's not necessarily the same thing where they're coming in the captain spot. Now it can. We've seen 3 touchdown games from Mark Andrews, and Lamar Jackson is still plenty viable. But, certainly I like Lamar in the captain spot more than most quarterbacks that we talk about quite often. So I feel pretty good about that. I'd be scared of a fade on that 20% personally in this matchup. Anything else to add on Lamar, or should we go right over to Joey B here?
No, I think you nailed it. I think the one thing that maybe I overlooked in saying that I would be a little bit underweight in the captain ownership is it's pretty easy to get to some nice double stacks with Lamar, which hasn't often been the case in Ravens slates in the past. And this is our first 2023 Showdown slate with the Ravens. This is the first time that we're going to have Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman and Odell Beckham and Mark Andrews, and you throw in Nelson Aguilar. Like we generally on the past have had 1 or 2 legitimate pass catching options for Lamar, and that's made it really difficult to find unique single and double stacks. I think it's going to be pretty easy to do that here. Now you'll have some combinations that are going to be fairly common, but I don't think a ton of people are going to find their way onto, some relatively high price or some relatively highly projected Lamar doubles with him at captain. So I think that that's fairly interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I think we got a super chat, which is not something we do over here, but appreciate you, Daniel. I don't even know who that money goes to. Anyway, we'll keep it going here with Joe Burrow, $800 less than Lamar Jackson. Very happy to see all the cap stuff seems to be in the rear view. The biggest concern for me on Burrow tonight is the matchup. However, this is big game Joey B. If anyone's going to go into Baltimore on a Thursday night against an elite pass D with their season up against the line or on the line, backs against the wall, and put up a 304, it's Joe Burrow. So I'm kind of putting matchup to the side when I'm making my Joe Burrow decisions tonight, and just leaning into him as any way that I normally would, or even more with kind of the expected high pass rate. How are you feeling about Burrow and this Bengals pass game offense?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. Obviously, a really, 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 really difficult spot against the Ravens. It's one of the best drop, however you want to slice it in terms of advanced metrics or even just base statistics. It's one of the toughest pass matchups that Joe Burrow is going to face all season, one of the toughest matchups in the entire league. But I'm kind of willing to ignore that here. This team, as we alluded to off the front, needs this win desperately. This is a very important game for them, not only being the divisional matchup, but just to stay afloat in the AFC, stay alive for kind of a wild card spot and to keep their hopes alive for a playoff push. They're going to put the ball in Joe Burrow's hands. All of the calf stuff seems to be behind them. And especially coming out of the week 7 bye, they've posted pass rate over expectation games of 7%, positive pass rate over expectation games of 7%, 13%, and 14%. They've got the league's highest pass rate over expectation, the second highest situation neutral pass rate. I know it's tough, but eventually at some point, the volume there does matter. And I think even if they're struggling with efficiency, I think that there's going to be enough volume here for Burrow to either come close to that 300-yard bonus or at least to have shots when they get into scoring position to find the end zone through the air. He's had multiple touchdowns in 6 of 9 games this season. It seems relatively safe even against this tough Baltimore Ravens defense. So I think for cash game contests, definitely a necessity there where he's only 10K. Feels like a very nice price tag for him as well. The flex ownership feels relatively efficient, maybe even something that's just a touch high in tournaments, but nothing ridiculous. The one where I start to get a little concerned is the captain ownership. I think if Joe Burrow at 10K has like a captain worthy performance, you're getting targets to condense enough here in this offense that it would be more likely that you would want Jamar Chase or even Tyler Boyd for that matter, who we'll talk about in a second, at a much cheaper price tag to be in that captain spot. So I think I'd probably get away from the 10% in tournaments with Burrow at captain. I'm fine coming in under that number and instead just prioritizing his pass catchers at that position. But that aside, cash game contest lock are Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. And, Yoshi being out, T. Higgins being out, even with the Tanner Hudson emergence and kind of that split tight end side of things, like this is a condensed route tree at this point. Like we know where these targets are going. I think you can take shots on these guys in captain and kind of get your exposure to Burrow in the flex. That's not to say I'd be completely ruling out Burrow. Again, there's enough talent there to spread the ball around. Alan makes this good point as you pull up on the screen. Looks like Marlon Humphrey is doubtful tonight, which certainly benefits Burrow and the entire pass game, particularly probably Jamar Chase we'll talk about in a second. But I agree with what you said there on Burrow. Okay, let's go on to running backs here. Let's get the Cincinnati side out of the way, right? There's one guy here that we're interested in, one guy with an absolute elite role in Joe Mixon, probably appropriately priced at 9,600 based on the role itself. But does Joe Mixon have a real ceiling these days, Cody? And does he in this matchup?
Boy, it sure doesn't feel like it. And it feels like, we've dealt with the Bengals a bunch on Showdown slates. We've been dealing with them on main slates as well. And it feels like, and kind of as I wrote in the article, there's nobody maybe in the entire league that feels more safe to give you like 10 to 15 DraftKings points. And no one that also at the same time feels less likely to give you more than that on any given slate than Joe Mixon. It feels like he, just because of the strong role that he has in a high-powered offense, he feels like he's really, really safe to give you double-digit points. And you see a 13.6 base projection there. We just haven't seen a ceiling from Joe Mixon, and now he's 9,600. He's only $400 cheaper than Burrow. He's only $1,400 cheaper than Jamar Chase. He's more expensive than some of the Baltimore Ravens pass-catching options that we find relatively attractive. He's more expensive, of course, than Tyler Boyd. He kind of just falls in this range where I don't feel like he's good enough at 9,600 in cash to consider rostering in cash, although I know there's a pretty safe floor there given his role. And we haven't seen the ceiling. I'm not sure there's a ceiling there for Joe Mixon to get excited about him in GPPs, both small and large field. So he kind of just falls in this no man's land where if he's going to be 36.8% owned and 6.4% owned at captain, you kind of just have to throw your hands up and hope that he does get you between those 10 to 14 points that he's done so consistently this season, and just hope that that's not enough to kill you, which I suspect it would not be if you faded him in tournaments. So I'm not finding myself getting all that excited about Joe Mixon tonight, and I hope that doesn't come back to bite me, but I just feel like he's owned a little bit too much, and he's a little bit too expensive for us to consider him too seriously in tournaments.
Yeah, where I get caught up here is the ownership, right? Under 40% for that role, definitely. And I think George just mentioned it in chat as well, right? Like we get these spots under owned all the time. It's one game, you never know what happens. We always like to bank on opportunity and fantasy, so I probably would look to come in a little bit over in flex, but throw your hands up, right? With Joe Mixon right now. Like I every now and then, 1 or 2 games a year, he's throwing the ceiling, and I think he did have a solid game a couple of weeks ago. But when you take into account a 2 or 3 year, 20 points 3 weeks ago, 17 2 weeks ago. So like I still wouldn't call those ceiling games, but at least the opportunity is presenting itself in like a good floor. If that's what you need on this slate with a ton of options for you on both sides, I don't know. It's a tough spot. There's some Stone Punt guys on this slate, but are you interested in either Travion Williams or Chris Evans here?
I did write Travion Williams up as like a large field MME dart throw. I think if that, sub 5% or anywhere around there holds, I think that's acceptable as like an MME part of your MME player pool. He still just isn't getting enough work. And even as kind of the de facto pass catching back in this offense, it's still a relatively meek role for him. And you've seen that in his box score production as well. 1, 2, 0, 0, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1. If you get 3 points from Travion Williams, you're probably doing backflips on a slate like this. And I don't think that would even be enough. So not a ton of interest in these non-Joe Mixon running backs at all. And to your and George's point, like there's an outcome here where I think Joe Mixon's ownership like even creeps below 30% because of some of the same things I thought up. If the field echoes my sentiments of like, well, this guy is fairly expensive. He's right there priced next to Joe Burrow. And this is just a guy that rarely gives me a ceiling. Why would I roster him? If the field agrees with me, then you could see a situation where he is 28, 29% owned. And I think at that point, he becomes a little bit more interesting. So I think final ownership here and just kind of your own feel based off of the contest that you're playing in is going to be very important in what you decide to do with Joe Mixon. If you think he's going to get squeezed out in whatever contest you're playing on DraftKings or FanDuel, then I do think he becomes a more interesting play because I think like 10 to 11 is a really safe floor. And yeah, there's upside there for 17, 18, 19, 20, which could potentially be enough. But we've just seen so many games where it's these low double digits. And I don't think that that's going to be enough on a slate where I expect to be, quite a bit of scoring.
Yeah, we spoke about it with James Cook on Monday night, right? He was 10K or whatever, which was crazy to begin with. And then there was all that weird usage stuff in the first half and et cetera. But we talked about like what you need out of him at that number. Is 20 enough on this slate out of a 9-6 or 10K running back? I don't know. And we have not, there's very little confidence that he's getting more than that. It's not, it's still within the range though. As people in chat notice it, anyone get in the end zone at any point, you can get in the end zone twice also, right? George noting that the routes runner up, like there's a narrative to be had here. How much you want to play it is up to you. I think it's a 5 play personally. All right, Baltimore side here. So we talk about volume, right? Let's start with Keaton Mitchell of it all. 4 carries, whatever. This has Devon Achane vibes from early in the season for sure. Before he kind of broke into a bigger role for Miami, and I think Harbaugh kind of hinted at him having more work this week. But you still save $1,400 from Keaton Mitchell to Gus Edwards. I still think they'll put Gus the Bus in on those goal line packages. So I think there's higher touchdown upside for Gus, higher floor for Gus, but I think there's no doubt that there's a higher ceiling at this point for Keaton Mitchell. How are you kind of sorting through these two guys, and do you buy into the Mitchell hype here?
Yeah, I know Leone's pulling his hair out trying to decide what to settle in on in terms of Keaton Mitchell's yards per carry baseline on this slate. And it does harken back to early season Devon Achane when it just felt like every time he touched the ball, he was going to score a 20-yard touchdown. We're kind of in the same realm here with Keaton Mitchell at this point at 5,600. And, if you just look at the usage profile and take the box score production out of it and take the name out of it and take the fantasy Twitter hype out of it, 5,600, 8.3 base projection, you would think there is no way I'm rostering Keaton Mitchell, but I think there's a lot of things pointing in a positive direction for him. This is a great spot for the Baltimore Ravens rushing attack as a 3.5 point home favorite against a Cincinnati defense, a Cincinnati run defense that has been god awful and just got diced up against Devin Singletary and the Texans. It seemed like every time you flip over to that game, he was breaking off another 10-yard run. They are allowing a bunch of explosive plays. Their stuff rate is very low. They're allowing a bunch of yards before contact. And now you kind of have this snowball effect of where we've seen Keaton Mitchell do this really efficiently on very limited touches in back-to-back weeks. And now you have his head coach, who's very reliable in terms of coach speak. Again, shout out to the coach speak index, as we've done a few times on the show of late. It pointed out that Harbaugh said in a post-game press conference that they're going to try to get Keaton Mitchell more touches. That's going to be a part of this week's game plan. That's already accounted for in his base projection to some degree. It just comes down to like, how much do you think Harbaugh is actually going to specifically give Keaton Mitchell more opportunities ahead of Gus Edwards and ahead of Justice Hill? If you just take a step back, this is still a three-headed backfield with also Lamar Jackson in the same backfield, who can steal rushing attempts and who can steal high-value touches in scoring position. So it's not one that I'm getting overly excited about, but on the opposite side of the coin here, we're seeing 17.5% projected ownership, which I feel like is just a touch low. And as we'll get to here kind of towards the end of the show, there's a lot of players in this mid 4s to mid 5K range where I don't think Keaton Mitchell's ownership is going to balloon all that much past where we currently have it projected. So if you want to bet on some upside, if you want to bet on him getting more touches and him continuing to be more efficient than an average running back, I think it's a fairly good play on tonight's slate.
Yeah, I think that's a well said. And if ownership's going to hold here, honestly, on all three of these guys, you can make an argument for all of them, right?
Oh,
but
yeah.
I want to play into ceiling, which to me is still Keaton, right? Touchdowns are so fluky. We've seen some ceiling games from Gus over the last couple of weeks because he's found the box 2-3 times or whatever in the same game. And of course, that's still in the range of outcomes there for Gus Edwards. But in this kind of game, give me that big play upside and the salary relief. And I'll probably land on Keaton Mitchell as my favorite of these three. I think you had mentioned in the article you would look at Docs when one is the captain, or maybe when one is in the lineup of those two.
Yeah, it's tough because I don't think like 7K plus 5,600 is entirely prohibitive, especially if you get like a really good game out of the Baltimore offense where they are efficient and have the ability to run the ball a little bit more than they want to later in the game if they're playing from ahead. You just have to kind of think about them combinatorially, right? If that's even a word. 12-6.
It is now.
12-6 for, what would be hopefully a vast majority of the Baltimore Ravens running back touches. It doesn't seem all that prohibitive if you're expecting their offense to be efficient. Now, if you're expecting this game to be play a little bit closer, maybe not be so efficient, then 12-6 for a vast majority of the Ravens running back touches starts to seem a little bit more tough to click in. So I try to think about it in terms of combination of pricing, what I'm getting from these players. And yeah, I think if you've got one of them in the lineup, you probably want a minor doc. And definitely if you've got one of them at captain, you probably want to consider a little bit more of a significant doc because you are hoping that one of these guys is either A, really efficient, or B, starts to take a lion's share of the carries, in which case we're probably hoping that guy is Keaton Mitchell. So I do think that docs with this backfield, when one of them are rostered, makes sense.
Super sharp stuff there when you think about things in combinations. And it often ties right into we always tell ourselves with a showdown lineup, you're painting a story. How do you feel the game is going to go? So if there are lineups that I want to build either Ravens heavy, or I think Ravens are in control and think they're going to be run heavy, etc., I don't mind two of these three guys together very much. Mm-hmm. But I think, as you said, yes, this is the majority of the Ravens carries, but we still have Justice Hill lingering around. We still have Lamar Jackson taking 8-ish carries a game. And so, you need to be certain that you like the Ravens side in this for me to want to really play those guys together in spades. Obviously, it's one game. Weird stuff can happen. But if I'm doing it in any kind of volume, I need to be certain that I like the Ravens side tonight, which I don't know if I play it that way or not. But that's kind of how I need. Do you have any Justice Hill specific thoughts here?
I think he's the most likely guy to just get squeezed out, that they don't feel like they need to give the ball to that much. If they are trying to scheme specific opportunities to keep Mitchell after the last couple of weeks, I think he's the guy that ends up losing the most. But on the opposite side of the token, in games where we think the Bengals do jump out to an early lead, or we need more pass game specific opportunities for somebody, I think Justice Hill still maintains at least a majority. Maybe it's a smaller majority, but I still think he would maintain a majority of the long down and distance plus 2-minute work, as he has done for a good portion of this season. So I think that's another game script related thing you want to consider. If Baltimore falls behind, maybe that makes me less interested in Gus Edwards. Maybe it makes me less interested in Keaton Mitchell, but Justice Hill would be on the field more in those situations, and that would make me more interested in him at 2,800. But kind of in the aggregate, I think it's a fair price tag for him, and there's a reason why he's only coming through with 8% ownership. That's kind of why.
All right, let's go over to. I want to jump back to Cincinnati because I think this is the more, potentially more important conversation with one of the most expensive players. Is he the most expensive? I think he's the most expensive player on the slate in Jamar Chase. And have SportsCenter on in the background. They were just doing a hit from Baltimore. I guess Jamar Chase is averaging 5 career games against the Ravens, 99 receiving yards. So just about 100 receiving yards in his 5 career games against Baltimore. This is a player that I think we consider a top 2, 3 receiver in the league by all, with Justin Jefferson on the shelf, certainly top 2, probably top 3 by all other metrics and opinions. 11K probably has a ceiling that, in my view, only maybe Lamar, when everything hits right, also has on this slate. Should be benefited with no Marlon Humphrey here. 68% total ownership, 16% captain ownership. Game script figures to be in his favor. How do you like Jamar Chase tonight?
Yeah, there's really nothing negative to say about Jamar Chase in terms of the usage profile, in terms of the talent, in terms of the quarterback play. And, now if we get into a situation where Marlon Humphrey is out, the matchup, and really with these alpha wide receiver ones like Jamar Chase, like Stephon Diggs, like Tyreek Hill, like AJ Brown, we're not worried about the cornerback that these guys are going up against, even in like the extreme scenarios, right? Like, yeah, it matters when it's Sauce Gardner and some of these guys that have really limited opposing receivers, but still in the aggregate, I think we're probably doing ourselves more harm than good by overreacting to who Jamar Chase is going to be running his routes against. Ultimately, it comes down to his talent, his opportunity, and kind of how the offense is going to play in the whole. The one thing that I'm most interested in is, where does this captain ownership for Jamar Chase ultimately settle? We have seen the field still, although it's a little bit less aggressively so, we've seen the field still kind of lean into these unicorn type assets in terms of showdown single game slates with like Lamar, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen. We're still seeing those types of quarterbacks end up being higher owned at the captain position than the alpha wide receiver ones, but it's starting to creep up into where it's almost getting flipped. And so now I'm wondering, do we get into a spot on this slate where could Jamar Chase, especially with T. Higgins out, could he flip Lamar Jackson in terms of ownership? We haven't seen too many receivers push that 20% threshold even this season, but guys that have done it, Stephon Diggs was 25.6% owned against the Bucs. Tyreek Hill was 21.9% owned against the Dolphins. Jamar Chase himself was 21.1% owned against the Bills. So now I'm wondering, do we get into this spot where Jamar Chase actually pushes north of 20% here, and that could bring some of these other guys down a little bit more? I think if that's the case, you have to start to seriously consider how much exposure you want at the captain spot. But there's really nothing negative to say about Jamar Chase or this spot. It really just comes down to, where does this final ownership settle in at? And do you want to try and get over that, or are you going to end up being comfortable coming in a little bit under?
Yeah. And you guys probably know this by listening to these shows with us. I think both of us are kind of suckers for these huge ceiling players, even at high cost and tough matchups and, everything. And Chase is just one of those guys that I'd be absolutely terrified of fading. No T. Higgins too. There are some concerns about how healthy he is, but Alyssa, another week under his belt. I'd imagine he's getting schemed a lot of stuff tonight. And I like Jamar Chase quite a bit. Would have no problem taking a pretty strong stand, getting over that 16% captain personally. Probably the biggest decision of the slate. We always talk about which maybe it's the Ravens pass catchers. We'll talk about them in a second, or maybe it's the Ravens running backs. There's a lot of them on this slate where we talk about if we had a magic wand and we can kind of see the right answer ahead of time. This is one of them to me, and that's Tyler Boyd and Trent Irwin. Obviously, you can play these guys together. Don't get me wrong, but that difference in price the $2,400 difference in price means a lot here. Yes, Boyd steps into that de facto Higgins role, and we saw it a lot last week, right? 30% target share, huge box score, could have been even bigger. The projections say that too, right? We have 4 more points on Tyler Boyd than we do on Trent Irwin, almost exactly 4 more points. 5 more? I can do math. But that price difference and Irwin stepping into that wide receiver 3 role is a big deal. So I like Tyler Boyd a little bit more. Trusted veteran, gets that big boost with no T Higgins, but I certainly understand the Irwin case. Again, if you want to fade the Chase side of it, but you're interested in the Bengals pass game and you want to do a Burrow double with these guys, I get that too. But to me, I want to play a lot of Chase. How are you handling the Boyd Irwin side of things?
Yeah, it's an interesting spot because I think Tyler Boyd has kind of correctly over the course of his career, and specifically with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase in the lineup, has been identified as a guy that has a pretty decent floor as a wide receiver 3, especially in a pass-happy offense like the Bengals like to run, but not a guy that is generally going to give you a big ceiling. Now, we don't have a big sample here, but in 4 games with T. Higgins sidelined, we've seen his targets climb from 5.4 per game to 9. And we've seen his PPR average skyrocket from 10.6 to 16. So I think he is a guy who, when you do remove a true, wide receiver 1B or wide receiver 2A type option in T. Higgins, he kind of steps in to fill that role, at least in terms of being a target earner. He's still going to run a majority of his routes from the slot. His overall playing time doesn't change all that much. The way he's used doesn't change that much. He just gets used more as a legitimate wide receiver 2 option. And I think still at 6,800, there is a Slate winning score in his bag. We just saw a pretty nice score last week on a 30% target share and 31% air yard share. So if you think that type of usage is sticky here, then I think at 6,800, Boyd is a really interesting play. And Trent Irwin is the guy who gets the big playing time boost, but not quite the target earner that obviously Jamar Chase is, and certainly a step down from even Tyler Boyd. You get the $2,400 in savings. He's going to be on the perimeter a bunch. He ran a route on 81% of dropbacks last week, and now you remove Yoshi, who ran a route on 26% of dropbacks last week. I think that wide receiver 3 role for Irwin is super, super safe. Like, he's very rarely going to come off the field. This isn't a team that likes to run 12 personnel. They're going to have Trent Irwin out there for a vast majority of their offensive snaps. And we've seen him get targeted deep downfield, which kind of creates this really wide range of outcomes here with Irwin. And so I think that if Irwin comes with lower ownership, much better play than if he's somebody who's going to be owned, because I think his range of outcomes are still pretty volatile. We saw, I think he got there in the first drive last week, right? And then really didn't do much or didn't do anything.
Touchdown.
Yeah,
it was like 231. First. Yeah, it was like 237 and a touchdown for his box score or something like that, or 241, something like that.
So got that on the first drive and then really didn't do much after that. So I think he's going to be a guy that's fairly volatile. And if he's going to come with ownership, would prefer to play away from that. If I get the sense that he gets squeezed at all, or people are really preferring, either Tanner Hudson, who's cheaper, or Tyler Boyd, who's a little bit more expensive, and Trent Irwin gets squeezed as a result, then I think he becomes a more interesting play. But 28.9% total ownership, probably a number that I would just prefer to come in a little bit underweight on.
254 and 1 for Irwin last week. I should note. Okay, so I think both guys are underpriced, right? So let's think about it this way. I'm not saying Tyler Boyd is T. Higgins, and I'm not saying Trent Irwin is Tyler Boyd. But if T. Higgins were on this slate and Tyler Boyd were in his normal wide receiver 3, I mean, we see it. T. Higgins is 8K, right? Boyd probably would be, 56, 6K or something. I'm curious what he historically is when all 3 guys are healthy. But you get Irwin at 4,400, which is definitely cheaper than Boyd would be as a wide receiver 3. And you get Boyd at 6,800, which we could see is cheaper than what T. Higgins normally is as the wide receiver 2. So you could definitely make an argument for all different combinations of these guys. I think if you want to play a Bengals onslaught with all 3 of them because of how condensed this is, you could do that. It's a lot of salary to eat up, and you just have to hope that Tanner Hudson isn't as involved as he was last week. But I think you can do that. I like all of them. I really do. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but I like all these guys, even in a tough matchup. You and I are starting Tyler Boyd and Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow in a main event team tonight, so we're hoping for the best from this offense here.
Yeah, and the way that I go through like the Showdown breakdown and the way that my brain tries to process the slate so I can get prepared to build my own lineups, we start with team level stuff, and that's kind of how we do it here on the show. And then I go into the away team, pass catchers first, running backs, quarterback, home team, pass catchers, running back, quarterback. And then I kind of break it down from like, who do I think after all that are the top plays? And generally in these spots where it's like, okay, I like Jamar Chase because he's an alpha. Of course, I'm going to like Jamar Chase. I like Tyler Boyd because he's stepping into a wide receiver 2 role, feels underpriced. I like Trent Irwin because he's going to be on the field a bunch and is underpriced. And then we'll get to the tight ends here in a second. I kind of like Tanner Hudson too a little bit. It makes me feel like, why am I not a little bit more interested in Joe Burrow doubles with Burrow at captain than I seem to be? Because I like all of his pass catchers. I'm probably going to roster multiple pass catchers on a good number of lineups. Why am I not more interested in Joe Burrow captain? So that kind of brings me back to the initial point of like, maybe Joe Burrow at captain is going to be a little bit underowned, and I could get some of these nice, highly projected teams that can capture some of this Bengals aerial upside if they can overcome the matchup, and you can get some really nice teams that way. So I think that may be something I should consider a little bit more, is just going captain Joe Burrow with 2 of these guys, because again, it's really tough to say from at least a usage and price perspective. It's really tough to say anything bad about them. They've just got to come through against a really good Ravens secondary.
So this is, to me, where Showdown is most different than main slate. Obviously, it's a completely different game. But what I mean is, on main slate, when I play Joe Burrow, I lock him with Jamar Chase.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there's a case when he's going up against all these other quarterbacks that he's getting there without Jamar Chase also having a huge game. On a 1-game slate, Joe Burrow and captain, obviously I want to double stack, but I almost want to do it on the teams where I'm fading Chase, because that 11K tag, his score has to be so huge that I probably still want him in captain in almost every scenario. Not every single one, but most. That I like Burrow and captain with doubles or triples when I'm going Boyd and Irwin together, and I'm kind of deciding, hey, I'm going to fade Chase. Maybe the Ravens are going to try to scheme him out of this game. And that's where this is different. I prefer Burrow in that most important spot without Chase tonight, probably.
And to that point, you can see these games. We've seen it with Allen and Diggs too. We've seen it with some of these guys, Hurts and AJ Brown. It feels like it hasn't happened so much. But when you have these, alpha quarterbacks and alpha wide receivers, when they're so highly priced on Showdown, you could have a good Jamar Chase game tonight where you've got Joe Burrow at captain, you've got him with Boyd and Irwin, and Jamar Chase still scores 17 DraftKings points. Maybe because he's 11K, that just is too much to fit in the flex in those lineups anyway. So you can get a captain-worthy Joe Burrow performance, and Jamar Chase isn't in there just because he's too expensive to fit.
Yeah, our guy Yao Pete probably says it in a more concise way than I was trying to say. Right, Chase can carry Burrow when he's captain, right? Yep. I don't know if there's enough meat on the bone at that 11K tag for Burrow when Burrow scores his captain score for Chase to be carried necessarily. He can, and in that case, again, the Bengals are winning the game. Like paint the narrative, right? The Bengals are not only winning that game in that case, they're winning by a surprising score, probably, if Burrow is the captain with Chase and at least 1 or 2 others in the flex with the way pricing plays out. Not saying it's impossible, unlikely. So I also like the Burrow doubles, but I like them when I'm kind of looking away from Chase, probably more than Burrow in captain with doubles. All right. The Sox tight end here, preseason Hall of Famer, as you mentioned, Tanner Hudson, certainly more involved right now as a pass catcher, probably maybe even more tonight with Yoshi out. A little bit icing Irv Smith, who was obviously their offseason addition, kind of reclamation project for them here, has not been the guy for the Bengals, but we do see Tanner Hudson out there running routes, catching balls. So how are you kind of breaking down this tight end position here?
Yeah, look, I'm not fooling myself in thinking that the Bengals are suddenly going to switch what they've done under Zach Taylor for his entire tenure here. They're not going to suddenly go to a bunch of two tight end sets just because Yoshi's out and because T. Higgins is out. They're just going to move the next guy up. And so what that means is you're still going to see 85 to 90% of their offensive snaps come with Jamar Chase and Trent Irwin on the perimeter, with Tyler Boyd in the slot, and with one of Tanner Hudson, Irv Smith, or Drew Sample in at tight end. So you're still contending with 3 bodies for, roughly 100%, maybe 120% total snap share. And you're going to see a situation where route participation looks like it's fairly evenly distributed. Maybe you get up to 35-40% for Tanner Hudson on a high end, 30 to 35% for Irv Smith, and then 25 to 30% or something like that for Drew Sample. The reason why I'm interested in Tanner Hudson is he's $400 cheaper than Irv Smith. You see he's got a higher base projection. I think that base projection being higher than Irv Smith is definitely right. not only back to the preseason days with Tanner Hudson, but through some regular season games with various teams, the Giants, the 49ers, and now with the Bengals, he's shown an ability to earn targets when he's been on the field. He just hasn't been on the field much. And I don't know why that is. Each time that he seems to get opportunities, whether it be in the preseason or regular season, he looks like a pretty dang good tight end. I think we're finally seeing that come to fruition a little bit. I don't think he's going to suddenly become a full-time player, but I do think he's going to be a little bit more of an important offensive piece down the stretch for them. He is a very good pass-catching tight end, and I think they're going to continue to have to use him as such. So I do like Tanner Hudson. I think he's like fringe cash game playable. I don't know if you need to go there at the $2,600 price tag with some of these other cheap options, but I think you could find lineups that you like with him in there. But definitely, if he's going to hold it 11%, a very, very, very strong GPP play.
Yep. Totally agree. Okay. Cody, let's go over to the Baltimore pass catchers. I don't know if you have anything to say on Stanley Morgan or Charlie Jones.
No.
150 set viable?
Yeah, like total large field MME to player, yeah, they 3 to 4% sprinkle. That's fine with me, but it's got to be a 150 large field MME type thing for me.
All right, Cody, let's go over to the Baltimore pass catchers. The people have been asking for us to disagree, Cody. People don't like that we agree so much. And I read your article, and you loved yourself some Zay Flowers. Yep. And I get it. It's an exciting prospect. We'll talk about Andrews in a second. Let's talk about Zay Flowers first. Exciting prospect. The price is probably right at 7,600. Has led this team in targets all year. Good stuff. You mentioned in your article, really solid floor. I agree. Maybe the best floor of any skill position guy on this slate. I love his floor. I don't know if I trust the ceiling yet. You said he has slate breaking ceiling, and I bet you the numbers, his underlying stuff probably tells you it does. If, I said leading in targets, respectable for his kind of player, 8.9 yard, 8 out or whatever it is, respectable for the kind of player he is. I don't know if I trust the ceiling. Maybe that's just touchdown regression. He only has one touchdown on the year, but I can also say, hey, he played the whole first half of the season without Rashad Bateman. It's Mark Andrews that finds those touchdowns. Odell Beckham is still a guy that has a nose for the end zone. We've now seen Gus Edwards and Keaton Mitchell introduced into this offense as guys that can find the end zone. I do not trust the ceiling on Zay Flowers. He is not my favorite play tonight. Make your Zay Flowers case.
All right, you've painted the bear picture. Let me now that I've got loaded up with a little bit more caffeine, let me paint the bull case for Zay Flowers. You alluded to it. I mean, leads the team in target share, 24.5%, leads the team in air yard share at 25.7%, first read target share, design target share. This team, this coaching staff has shown a willingness to get him the ball. And I think the one thing that really sold me on Zay Flowers was not just the floor, but the combination of floor and potential upside that, we haven't seen yet, but I think we will see at some point before this season's over. And what better spot than against the Bengals, who have given up the league's second highest explosive pass rate. What really sold me was checking out PFF. He leads the team in targets behind the line of scrimmage with 18 targets behind the line of scrimmage, right? That makes sense. Let me scheme up quick passes, screens, whatever they may be, to my wide receiver who has explosive after the catch ability. That makes sense. He also leads the team in 20-plus yard downfield targets with 13. So you're giving me this safe PPR floor where I think he's probably going to get 2 to 3 targets behind the line of scrimmage, really close to 100% catch rate for somebody like Zay Flowers. So you're giving me 2 to 3 PPR points. Maybe he breaks one of those. He doesn't need to, but maybe he breaks one of those for a long gain or a touchdown. That would be fantastic. But he's also going to get 1 to 2, maybe 3 targets of 20-plus yards downfield. That's a fantastic role for a wide receiver who, if he comes down with one of those, could house one of those and could turn that into 6 or 7 points right there. I think it's a really awesome role. If you look at the box score production, obviously it has not been there yet for him. I do think it's coming. And I think part of the reason why it really hasn't been there, he's been under 13 DraftKings points in 8 of 10 games, and his max this ceiling is 18. So I get it. I think there's been a cap to this point, but I think part of that can at least be explained away by some of the randomness of the way the Ravens have scored their touchdowns this season, and part of the way that the Ravens offense has kind of been game scripted out of games a little bit, where they've been a little bit more run heavy, where their defense has done a bunch of damage. If this turns into a back and forth affair, I think you could see a bunch of Zay Flower targets and a bunch of Zay Flowers points.
Fair argument. Fair argument. I look at it on your 10-game sample of not even getting close to sniffing 20 points, basically, with 217s as his high. And I actually disagree with what you just said there too. I think what PLO2 is saying is right. I think you want Zay Flowers more when this game goes under. And when we're kind of, because I don't know if I trust the ceiling, but I do know I think there's a lot of paths to 15 points for. I think there's a lot of 8 for 70s type of play. And yes, of course,
Yeah.
he gets those targets downfield, he could break one. But I think when you get those 8 for 60s, 8 for 70s, when the game goes under, it's not because he could get that type of score when the game goes over as well. But in that case, in a game with a ton of attractive skill position players, you're going to have a lot more guys that have higher ceilings. So if my ceiling theory right now, which again, you pointed the case that we are probably going to see it at some point with Zay, but if you are taking my side of this, when the game goes over like that, I want Mark Andrews, right? I want the guy that so consistently has had 5 for 80 and 2. I talk about that as like the typical Mark Andrews box score, but I feel like I've seen so many of those from Mark Andrews the past couple of years. I don't know the metrics on Bengals against tight ends, but chat is telling me that the Bengals have been bad against tight ends this year. That's even more. I would boost personally, because you're seeing basically the same ceiling projection, 0.9 more on Mark Andrews than Zay Flowers. I would boost Mark Andrews' ceiling projection in my runs to get a little bit above there, so that a $1,200 difference that makes up for that $1,200 difference between Andrews and Flowers. For me personally, I like Andrews a lot tonight at 8% captain. I know that there's a ceiling there. I know that he has a nose for the end zone. I know he's still at least Lamar's favorite high leverage target. So I prefer Andrews tonight if I'm choosing between one of those two. I like saying cash though. I do like saying cash.
Yeah.
And then I do get the case as well. But we'll see.
Look, I mean, you look at these two guys, and they're basically the same player, at least in terms of there's a little bit of a discount there on Zay, which will make him a little bit more of an attractive cash game piece. But you look at projection, 13.3 versus 13.2. Ceiling is separated by 0.9 points. The projected ownership in flex is virtually the same. Captain ownership is exactly the same. So I can get the point that you're making too. And this is where I go back to like, do I really want to get that much overweight on these really highly owned captains like Lamar and like Jamar Chase, when I agree with you. I like Mark Andrews. I like Zay Flowers. I like Tyler Boyd a little bit. So can I get this stance where I have overweight positions on these lower owned captains that I like while still getting close to enough of the obvious high ceiling guys like Jamar Chase and Lamar Jackson? I don't know if that's going to end up being the case. So I'm going to have to decide where I ultimately stand on some of these guys, but I think it is a great spot for Mark Andrews. It's really tough to deny that. As the chat was pointing out, Bengals very bad against opposing tight ends. They've given up the 5th most DraftKings points per game to opposing tight ends, and that kind of makes sense too. They're giving up the 4th highest target share to opposing slot receivers. Obviously, Mark Andrews going to run a ton of routes from the slot. I think he's a matchup nightmare for this Bengals defense as well. So I do like Mark Andrews. I do like Zay Flowers. After that, it starts to get a little bit thinner for me. But talk to me about the rest of these Bengals, or the rest of these Ravens wide receivers. Do you like anybody else here? If you're not super into the Zay Flowers ceiling, do any of these cheaper guys do it for you?
Yeah, let's talk about the rest of these guys. So Odell is the next guy up here at 5,200. I did see something out of Odell that was encouraging last week, and that was that play he took to the house, which was the old Eli Manning to Odell Beckham play, that slant, that just like, oh, one cut, I'm gone. That was very encouraging to see. Now, that was the only target of the game. He's a little banged up. So I just painted your bear and your bull case in one thing. Eye test wise was really encouraged by what I saw of Odell. The other part of the bull case is they still paid that guy a lot of money this season. I still think they want him out there because the defense is stuff to account for him, etc. But not the same player as he was obviously 4 or 5 years ago. Mixed with the fact that he's got all this target competition and he's a little banged up. I get the down case. Bateman, on the other hand, has now been earning some more targets, right? Was part of my bear case in the Flowers side of it all. Half that target stuff with Flowers came before Bateman was even really available this season. At 4 targets last week, was only a 2 for 25, but he's out there. He's earning targets. I still think we believe in the talent. I would probably not play much Odell Beckham and Rashad Bateman together when we have Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews dominating this offense, the pass game. But get in where you fit in from a price perspective. I think both guys belong in your player pool, and ownership seems pretty efficient to me. I would take the Beckham upside still from an ownership perspective, assuming he's out there and everything's okay with his health and everything. With the 12% ownership, touchdown upside, big play upside, all that. I slightly lean Beckham in tournaments, but curious your take on those.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting decision point. Maybe not for cash game context, because I don't know if Rashad Bateman quite qualifies. Of course, you have Trent Irwin at 4,400. You have kickers who we'll get to in a second, and some other guys that are a little bit cheaper. But I think Rashad Bateman, based off of this projection and this price tag, is kind of fringe cash game playable. And so I asked the projection team about this. I think this is a pretty wide gap in terms of base projection between Odell and Rashad Bateman. And basically the take that I got from Mark and Jack was kind of that they think what happened last week in terms of route participation is fairly sticky going forward because of kind of some of the watch the tape stuff that, like, Rashad Bateman has been earning more targets. He looks a little bit more fluid out there. Maybe there's something to this Odell Beckham, who was not in practice last week yesterday with the sore knee. Part of that was probably just maintenance related, but they think going down the stretch that Rashad Bateman's going to be a little bit more offensively involved. And we kind of saw that happen in week 10, 77% route participation for Bateman, 40% route participation for Beckham. But the counter there is what you just said, that Beckham broke that 40-yard touchdown run and looked pretty good in doing so. Does that earn him, back to the level of opportunities that he saw in weeks prior? I'm kind of leaning into the recent usage with Rashad Bateman being on the field a little bit more. So I like him even at 8% higher ownership. I like him a little bit more where he's $400 cheaper. But I could see anyone making the case to flip it back to Beckham at, maybe potentially sub 10% ownership could be a little bit more interesting. I will just side with what we saw last week and kind of put my eggs in the Rashad Bateman basket.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. Nearly 75% of snaps for Bateman last week. Have not seen it in the box scores this year at all.
Mm-hmm.
But he's out there. I think we still live without. I will say this: best projections team in the entire world. We do have at ETR, no doubt. I've always thought we've been a little bit hot on Rashad Bateman stuff, I'm not questioning their numbers at all. We have Jack and Mark and Leone slaving over every single number, every single decimal. Just my humble, complete outside view opinion. We've seemed a little hot on Bateman stuff to me, but that's just one guy's opinion.
I think these two guys combined for 100% or slightly higher than 100% target share or 100% route participation rate. Both of these guys are going to play a majority of their routes on the perimeter opposite Zay Flowers. So if you want to even that up, you could certainly do that in the solver or fantasy labs, whatever you're using. If you want to take a point from Bateman and give it to Beckham to even these guys up a little bit, if you think they're closer, you can absolutely do that. That's something I recommend. If you think that a situation just doesn't pass the sniff test for you, or if you've got a different read, don't hesitate to do that. I think, as you mentioned, Gary, these guys are kind of in direct 1-for-1 competition, not only for targets, but for playing time too. So I don't want to play these guys together too frequently.
Another guy that I wouldn't want to play with these two and that the chat is asking a lot about is Nelson Aguilar. Only $800 here. Very clearly the wide receiver 4. He's out there. There's going to be some 4 receiver sets or just, a guy that'll come in on some 3 receiver sets as well. Seems like one of the better forms of salary relief on the slate if you want to attack that. Do you like Aguilar as much as the chat here, Cody?
Yeah, if you want to get into some really stars and scrubs heavy lineups, I think Aguilar is the best way to access those lineups. And I think at $800 and sub 10% ownership right now, it makes sense. He's running 71.8% of his routes from the slot. They like him as the slot receiver, whereas Beckham and Bateman are mostly going to be used on the perimeter. They will use Aguilar primarily in the slot. So I think he's fairly safe in some of those 3 and 4 wide receiver sets that they'll run. 9.7% target share, 14.7% air yard share. He, to me, seems like the guy, the stone punt option that if you needed 4 to 6 points on this slate, he's the guy most likely to give that to you.
Cool. All right. I don't have anything to add. I think he's fine. Any interest in Likely here?
Nah. I mean, MME 150 player pool, sure, but no.
Which is a shame because I still want to see them try more double tight end stuff. And with I love the talent, but there's just too many options here, I think, at this point.
Right.
Okay. Let's separate DSTs and kickers out because Justin Tucker on a Showdown slate is always worthy of his own this conversation. And so is Evan McPherson, who's one of the more popular kickers in the league at this point. So 2 popular kickers. I remember we haven't had this conversation much this year, but last year I remember having this conversation a lot. It's like when there's one of those very popular kicker names, right, on the slate, guys that are household names, even at least from the NFL fan perspective. And Justin Tucker, probably being the greatest kicker of all time, is certainly one of them. Usually you're going to see an ownership increase. Do you feel that way tonight? And are you interested in these kickers?
Yeah, I fired off a tweet right before while we were tech lording because you brought this up last season a couple of times and it stuck fresh in my mind. This is our first Baltimore Ravens Showdown slate of the season. And yes, we've not had Justin Tucker at a $5,400 price tag. Yes, the field has started to show a little bit of an aversion to kickers in showdown slates, but historically, average kicker ownership since 2020, full 3.5 seasons now worth of data here, 19.9% for an average NFL kicker on a showdown slate. Justin Tucker, during that same time frame, 33.2% average ownership. You're seeing us with a 22.1% projection. I will go out on a very strong limb here and say that Justin Tucker is very likely to be higher than 22.1% projected ownership right now. And if you go back to that discussion that we had about Keaton Mitchell at 5,600 and Trenton Irwin at 4,400 and some of these other guys, Rashad Bateman at 4,800, Odell at 5,200, I think if Tucker's going to separate in terms of ownership there, that those skill position players seem like better plays to me. So I'm not super interested in a high-priced, highly owned kicker, even though it is Justin Tucker. And I think he's the greatest kicker of all time. I think I'm probably going to be a little bit underweight him in tournaments. McPherson's another one who has historically been a little bit higher owned than we have projected. His ownership over that same time frame is 26.9%, and he's 4K. So I think Evan McPherson's ownership might come up a little bit here too, kind of widely known as a good kicker. Had that stretch through the playoffs where he was very good as well. So I think you could see McPherson's ownership come up a smidge too, but I do think at 4K, he's a much better option. At 4K, he really just needs to beat those skill position players that are priced right around him and doesn't need to beat them by much in order to be optimal. So I do like Mr. McPherson a little bit. On the defensive front, I think both defenses are going to be a little bit underplayed just because of how attractive the offensive options are. And generally, when we have those types of slates where you have so many very good defensive options, you don't see the field get to too many. You have so many good offensive options, I should say. You don't see the field get to too much of either defense. So I do think at 4,600, the Ravens defense, which we have talked about ad nauseum today, being both good against the run and against the pass, I think they profile as a pretty strong play at 4,600. The Bengals a little bit tougher simply because you're going to have the Ravens running so much, and because of Lamar's ability to avoid sacks, it's a little bit tougher for them to rack up defensive production. But I think at 3,600, where potentially they could be sub 10% owned, they profile as a relatively interesting option as well.
Worth noting, very nice weather here in the Northeast tonight. You know, my kind of misconception. I'm only like 2.5 hours from Baltimore. New York, we have very nice weather, like 50s and sunny. It looks like tonight in Baltimore, very similar, 55. Very little wind, clear night. So as far as those kickers are concerned, something that you're always looking at. Looks good for both those guys. And I agree. McPherson, underpriced. Weirdly underpriced there. And I don't have anything to add on your defense takes. All right, Cody, that brings us to the flag plant portion of the program, right around the hour mark. What do you got for me?
Yeah, first time I think, have disagreed through, almost 11 weeks now. And I'm going to have to take my side of the bull/bear case for Zay Flowers tonight.
Nice.
Think the role for Zay Flowers is good enough for him to get to access a ceiling performance in games where the Baltimore offense feels more compelled to pass. If there's ever a time when they feel more compelled to pass, I think it's going to be against a Joe Burrow-led offense, a Bengals offense that can be explosive in its own right. So a guy that leads the team in target share, air yard share, first read target share, design target share, leads the team in targets of 20-plus yards downfield. I think, though we have yet to see it, there's a 20-plus point upside in Zay Flowers' bag. I am hopeful that we get it tonight at 7,200.
All right, and I'll just go ahead and take that other side. Give me Mark Andrews. Listen, both guys are good plays. I'm not going to say you're saying Zay Flowers is a bad play, but I know Mark Andrews 2 weeks ago, right? 10 targets, 9 for 80, just didn't find the end zone. Like, we have those 9 for 80s with 2 with him plenty of times. So just give me that kind of game, and it's fine. We've had 2 games in the mid-20s so far for Mark Andrews. No 30-point games yet for him, but we've also seen those games from Andrews over the last handful of years. I do not agree with our projection. I will say that, with them being only 0.9 separated from their ceiling spot. I would be boosting Andrews personally tonight. And no matter how, I kind of like flipping this build a little bit, especially because of how much Cincy is going to have to throw. I like going a little Cincy heavy on the throw side and their side with Andrews as a bring back, either in captain or otherwise. Really like Mark Andrews tonight. quite a bit. Yeah, of course, always happens, right? We've picked
No,
from the
no,
same
no.
side of
What
things.
happens is we go double flag playing on Baltimore pass catchers, and they both fall flat on their face. So
Right,
you
right,
guys,
exactly. So
we've done this before with Denver. We've done this before with other
the
offenses.
Jets, I was clairvoyant in that we did Brees Hall and Garrett Wilson two couple slates ago, and I was clairvoyant and said that the Jets would, like tongue in cheek, I said they'll go out and score 6 points, and they scored 6 points. So
Exactly,
uh,
6 points was so
I
perfect.
did I did at least say that I think I kind of like attacking the Cincy side and then bringing these Baltimore guys as
Yeah,
on the other side. So going to be a really fun one. Excited to see which style wins out. Right, Ravens want to control this game on the ground. Bengals know they have to pass. Probably will be really fun to watch. I wish you all the absolute best of luck here tonight, Cody. We will be back on Monday. Yeah, right. We'll do Monday night. Monday night's a great one.
oh,
That's a
good
Super
one.
Bowl repeat. We got Philadelphia at Kansas City. Get ready for all the Kelsey narratives. Kelsey Taylor Swift talk all week. But hey, it's going to be a fun NFL game. We'll be back for that one. Wish you all the best of luck tonight. Thank you guys for tuning in. We will see you on Monday night.